Good evening. Welcome to the Old North Church. We're delighted to welcome you on this beautiful final day of May. I'm Matthew Cadwell, the vicar in charge of the church, and it's a special pleasure and a delight to welcome you as we gather for this wonderful lecture on the separation of church and state and religious liberty. As you may know, Old North is the oldest standing church in Boston. We were built in 1723, and we stand tall still, I think, as a symbol of freedom and liberty, even after all these years. And we shine brightly in people's hearts, and so it's a pleasure to welcome you and our panelists and our speaker, Professor Brekus, today. I am going to now invite Nikki, our Executive Director of Old North Illuminated, to say a few words.
Welcome, everyone, and especially welcome to everyone who's tuning in from across the country. It's very exciting for us here at Old North. As Matthew mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of Old North Illuminated. We are the nonprofit that oversees education, interpretation, and preservation here at the church. And this topic tonight is particularly interesting to us because our interpretation really explores the mythology of our nation's founding and the ongoing complexity and evolution of the American identity. So it's a perfect event to host here at Old North. And for those of you who are tuning in, who may not make it to Boston this year or next, I do want to give a plug for a new virtual reality tour on our website. So you can still visit the church after tuning in tonight at oldnorth.com. And for those of you who are here in person or who will be in Boston this summer, I want to give a plug for an original play that is about to open here for a 14-week run, and you can grab a postcard for it in the back if you're interested. And lastly, I want to give a very important logistical update, which is that the restroom in the rear of the parish house is open. So if you need to pop out during the program, some of our staff are at the back door, and we'll get you pointed in the right direction. But with that, I would like to welcome Amanda Tyler to the lectern.
Well, good evening to everyone here gathered in this beautiful historic building and to our many viewers on the live stream. It is my honor to also welcome and thank you for joining us for the 2023 Walter B. and K.W. Shurden Lectures on Religious Liberty and the Separation of Church and State. We have an excellent program in store for you tonight. I am Amanda Tyler. I'm Executive Director of BJC, which stands for Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. A quick word about BJC. We are a coalition of individuals, churches, and 15 different Baptist denominational bodies, all working together to defend faith freedom for all. And we truly mean all. We do our work not just for Baptists, but also for Buddhists, for Methodists and Muslims, for Anglicans and atheists. And for 87 years now, we have headquartered our work on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. But defending faith freedom for all takes place in communities across this country, including wherever you are joining us from tonight. I hope that you will take the opportunity to learn more about us and our work on our website, bjconline.org, and on social media at bjconthehill. And you can also join us on social media by using the hashtag Shurden Lectures tonight. You can also learn more about a campaign that we lead that is very relevant to the topic of tonight's lecture, Christians Against Christian Nationalism. You can learn more about that at christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org and on social media on Instagram and TikTok at End Christian Nationalism. I want to thank the BJC staff team for their work in bringing together tonight's event, and specifically Communications Director Guthrie Graves Fitzsimmons and Dr. Sabrina Dent, who is the Director of BJC's Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation. I also want to thank Buddy and Kay Shurden for their generous gift to endow these lectures, now in their 18th iteration. This lecture series is typically held at college and university campuses around the country, and we are so grateful to partner this year with Old North Church and Old North Illuminated to bring you tonight's event in this gorgeous and historic site as part of the 300th anniversary of the church. I want to thank Matthew Cadwell, Nikki Stewart, and Jaimie Crumley and Jason Fishman for their hospitality and collaboration to make this event possible. And now, I am delighted to introduce tonight's lecturer, Dr. Catherine Brekus. You can read her biography in your physical or electronic program, but I will share with you some of those highlights. Dr. Brekus is Charles Warren Professor of the History of Religion in America at Harvard Divinity School, Chair of the Committee on the Study of Religion in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and an associate member of the Program in American Studies and the Department of History. Her research focuses on the relationship between religion and American culture, with particular emphasis on the history of women, gender, Christianity, and the evangelical movement. She is the author of many articles and books and is currently writing a book about the relationship between American nationalism and Christianity. Dr. Brekus has received several awards, including a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship, a Henry Luce III Faculty Fellowship in Theology, and a Pew Faculty Fellowship in Religion and American History. Her book, Strangers and Pilgrims, won the Brewer Prize from the American Society of Church History. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Brekus to deliver her lecture, The Myth of American Chosenness.
Good evening, everyone. It is so wonderful to be here in this beautiful space and to see people here, and welcome to all of you online. It's especially wonderful to see some of my students here who have heard all of this before, so I'm really flattered that they're back to hear it again. So as Amanda mentioned, I'm writing a book that I'm calling Chosen Nation, which asks the question, what does it mean for people in the United States to say that they live in a chosen nation, or in more secular language, in an exceptional nation? So let me begin with a story that dates from almost 150 years before the founding of the United States. A story which reflects not only the deep historical connection between Christianity and the belief in American chosenness, but which also foreshadows the morally complicated future of the nation. In 1630, John Winthrop, one of the founders of Massachusetts Bay, where we stand, wrote a lay sermon entitled A Model of Christian Charity, a sermon that he may have delivered aboard the Arbella, the ship that brought the Puritans across the sea to New England. We're not actually sure he ever delivered it at all, but it's a fascinating text. Winthrop was a deeply religious man, and like other Puritans, he hoped to purify the Christian tradition from what he perceived as its degradation and corruption. Inspired by the story of the biblical Israelites who had crossed the Red Sea to enter into the Promised Land, he depicted the Puritans as a chosen people in covenant with God. Borrowing an image from the Gospel of Matthew, he claimed that New England would be a city on a hill. For we must consider that we shall be as a city on a hill, he wrote. The eyes of all people are upon us. Winthrop's language was self-important, even triumphalist. It was astonishing to claim that a small band of Puritan settlers numbered among the chosen people of God. But in most of his sermon, Winthrop spoke with greater humility. He emphasized that the Puritans' covenant with God was not only a blessing, but a burden. To be a city on a hill was to be called to practice a radical form of Christian love. We must be knit together in this work as one man, he testified. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. This is really a beautiful speech in which Winthrop has found, it seems like, every example of love in the Bible. Winthrop believed that if the Puritans could live up to this demanding vision of Christian love, God would shower them with his grace. But if they fell into sin, they would be punished just as the biblical Israelites had been. Based on his close reading of the Hebrew Bible, Winthrop believed that chosenness included suffering, sacrifice, and punishment. Instead of predicting a glorious destiny for God's new city on a hill, he ended his sermon with words of warning. If we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God and all professors for God's sake. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us till we be consumed out of that good land whither we are going. Some of you may recognize that Winthrop was quoting the words of Moses, who was allowed to see the promised land but never to enter into it. Winthrop ended his sermon on this sobering note because he wanted to encourage the Puritans to privilege the common good over their own selfish interests. But his inspiring vision of Christian unity had limits. Though he never explicitly mentioned Native Americans, he implied that not everyone was worthy of Christian charity. He and other Puritans expressed no qualms about settling on indigenous lands. In a brief aside meant to emphasize the importance of obeying God's commands, Winthrop reminded his Puritan listeners that in the Bible, Saul lost his kingdom when he refused to follow God's orders to annihilate every man, woman, child, and animal in the nation of Amalek. In Winthrop's vision of the city on a hill, the same God who demanded self-sacrificing love could also call his chosen people to exterminate the native inhabitants of the land. In 1637, only 7 years after writing the model of Christian charity, Winthrop insisted that the Puritans had been called to wage war against the Pequot and to take their lands. In 1637, Puritans and their Narragansett allies massacred between 600 and 700 Pequot in Mystic, Connecticut, not only warriors, but also children, women, and the elderly. Determined to destroy the entire tribe, troops pursued the remaining Pequot to New Haven, where they captured about 200 of them. They executed the men, sold the women and children into slavery, and forbade the survivors to return to their land or to refer to themselves as Pequot ever again. They were deprived even of their name. Winthrop, the same man who had urged the Puritans to bear one another's burdens as their own, requested that some of the captives be given to him as slaves. By the end of the 1600s, approximately 1,200 Native Americans and 400 Africans had been sold into slavery in New England. So I begin with this disturbing, tragic story because it reveals that the myth of American chosenness has always involved a complicated mixture of arrogance, exploitation, reform, self-sacrifice, racism, and violence. Tonight, I will offer a brief historical overview of the myth of American chosenness in order to give us a deeper understanding of the recent resurgence of white Christian nationalism in our own time. I plan to make 5 main points, so here's the preview. First, as I've tried to demonstrate through John Winthrop's example, the belief that America has a special relationship with God has deep historical roots that extend all the way back into the 17th century, when British settlers claimed indigenous lands in North America as their own. Second, Christianity and nationalism were fused together during the American Revolution, when many patriotic Americans became convinced that the United States had been divinely destined to play a major role in world history. Third, in the first decades of the United States, many Americans assumed that God had ordained the United States to be a white Protestant nation governed by men. Fourth, during the 19th and 20th centuries, many of those who had been deprived of political equality, including enslaved people, Native Americans, and women of all races, demanded their rights by appealing to the nation's divine destiny. And fifth, the recent surge of white Christian nationalism reflects a deep uneasiness about the loss of the once privileged place of Christianity in our civic culture. My first point about the Puritans' identity as a new Israel lays the groundwork for the second. During the American Revolution, patriots argued that the United States was not simply, as Winthrop had claimed, a city on a hill, it was the city on a hill. Christianity was a crucial ingredient in the construction of American nationalism. Many supporters of the revolution were convinced that God had chosen the colonies to become a beacon of democracy to the rest of the world. It's worth thinking back to the very beginnings of the nation when we're talking about 13 very small colonies situated along the eastern seaboard, and yet people had such grandiose ideas about what these colonies would become. No book of the Bible was more popular during the Revolution than Exodus, the story of the Israelites' revolt against an oppressive king and the miraculous journey out of slavery. The Reverend Nicholas Street, who portrayed the revolution as a recapitulation of the crossing of the Red Sea, described King George III as Pharaoh and the colonists as the oppressed Israelites. As Street explained to his congregation, the British tyrant is only acting over the same wicked and cruel part that Pharaoh, king of Egypt, acted toward the children of Israel above 3,000 years ago. Describing taxation without representation as the equivalent of slavery, I'll come back to this, ministers complained that the British Parliament had, quote, threatened us and our posterity with perpetual bondage. But just as God had raised up the biblical Joshua, he had inspired an American Joshua, and here I'm quoting General George Washington, to lead his chosen people to freedom. Ministers claim that the book of Exodus was not just the history of the Israelites, it also foreshadowed the creation of the United States, which had always, supposedly, been part of God's providential plan to spread liberty around the globe. An American Zion, as it was known, blessed by God, would lead the entire world to redemption. Street's language was explicitly Christian, but his faith in America's sacred destiny was shared even by those who were skeptical of institutional religion. Benjamin Franklin, who might be best described as a deist, also conflated the story of the Revolution with Exodus. In 1774, when Congress considered creating a new seal for the United States, Franklin suggested that it should be an image of, quote, Moses lifting up his wand and dividing the Red Sea, and Pharaoh in his chariot overwhelmed with waters. The myth of American chosenness had Christian roots, but eventually it evolved into a vaguer, more secular faith in American exceptionalism, the belief that the United States plays a unique role in human history and should be a model of political, religious, and economic freedom. We can hear early expressions of this idea in Thomas Paine, who described the revolution as, quote, the birthday of a new world, and Thomas Jefferson, who, in his first inaugural, celebrated the United States as, quote, the world's best hope. I hope you hear that language. It's become so familiar in political discourse. But Christians would say the world's best hope is not the United States, but Jesus. In the elaborate biblical typology that settlers created to explain the Revolution, white Americans were the enslaved Israelites, the British were the Egyptians, and Native Americans were the Canaanites. Patriots justified their treatment of the original inhabitants of the land by remembering God's biblical command to destroy the people of Canaan. In a sermon entitled, "The United States Elevated to Glory and Honor," Ezra Stiles, the president of Yale, explained that American Indians should be regarded as, quote, Canaanites of the expulsion of Joshua. Like John Winthrop more than a century earlier, Stiles and other white Americans insisted that God himself had ordained the conquest of Native Americans and the theft of their lands. Many patriots, however, expressed some uneasiness about the continued existence of racial slavery. At a time when approximately 700,000 Africans were held in bondage, many white Americans recognized the contradiction between their demands for liberty and their participation in the domestic and international slave trades. In 1775, Quakers organized the first anti-slavery society in America, and in 1780, Pennsylvania became the first northern state to pass a gradual abolition act, with other northern states following. But the Constitution, even though it outlawed the slave trade, did not abolish slavery itself. And by the 1830s and 1840s, Southern Christians had created an elaborate biblical justification for enslavement. The Reverend Thornton Stringfellow, for example, a Baptist, reasoned that since God had shown favor to biblical patriarchs like Abraham and Isaac, who had been slave owners, then Southern planters could be confident that God favored them as well. Stringfellow also proclaimed that slavery was, quote, full of mercy. If not for slavery, he argued, millions of Africans would never have been exposed to Christianity, and their souls would have been damned. American slavery was supposedly part of God's providential plan to spread spiritual freedom around the world. This brings me to the third of my key points. In the first decades of the United States, many Americans assumed that God had ordained the United States to be a white and Protestant nation. To be clear, and contrary to what many Christian conservatives have argued today, the United States was not founded as a Christian nation. The First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, guaranteed that Americans were free to worship or not to worship as they pleased. But most Americans in the 18th century were Protestants, and despite their support of religious freedom, they assumed that they would always enjoy a privileged place in the Republic. Even the Baptists, avid supporters of the separation of church and state, supported reading the King James Version of the Bible in public schools. In 1844, Robert Bayard, a Presbyterian minister, argued that God had delayed the discovery of the New World until the era of the Protestant Reformation because of his providential plan to transform America into, quote, a great Protestant empire. At a time when large numbers of Catholic immigrants were arriving from Ireland and Germany, Bayard insisted that God had chosen America, quote, to throw off the shackles of Rome and to become in due time the most powerful of all Protestant kingdoms. America's national religion, he claimed, was evangelical Christianity, and its national character was Anglo-Saxon. To be chosen was to be white and Protestant. Given these sentiments, it isn't surprising that Catholic and Jewish immigrants were often viewed with suspicion by their Protestant neighbors who questioned their Americanness. Catholics in particular were perceived as a threat to democracy because of their allegiance to the Pope. In 1835, Lyman Beecher, one of the most influential ministers in antebellum United States, he was the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, suggested that the mass influx of Catholic immigrants, whom he compared to, quote, the locusts of Egypt, might be secretly plotting to seize control of the United States government and to create a Catholic nation ruled by the Pope. Later, in 1844, during one of the worst episodes of religious violence in American history, anti-Catholic riots broke out in Philadelphia, where 2 Roman Catholic churches were burned, more than 50 people were wounded, and 13 people were killed. When the Ku Klux Klan was reorganized in 1915, the first Klan had disbanded in 1869, it targeted not only African Americans, but also Catholics and Jews. By 1924, the Klan numbered more than 4 million members. This was not a fringe organization. And they identified themselves as the defender of God's special relationship with the United States. Choosing a fiery cross as their symbol and limiting membership to white Protestants, the Klan argued that they had been called to defend the nation from corruption. When new members were initiated into the order, they placed their hands on a Bible that lay on top of an American flag. Now, it's worth pausing here to note that anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism ran deep. There would not be a Catholic president in the United States until 1960, when John F. Kennedy narrowly defeated Richard Nixon, and there still has never been a Jewish president. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was common for Jews to be depicted as covetous, dishonest, and un-American. In 1915, when Leo Frank, the Jewish manager of a pencil factory in Atlanta, was accused of raping and murdering an employee, a 13-year-old girl, he was demonized as a greedy Jewish industrialist. During his trial, the courthouse was often surrounded by large crowds chanting, "Hang the Jew." Frank was eventually declared innocent, and historians have agreed with this verdict. But a mob, enraged by the verdict, broke into his jail cell, kidnapped him, and lynched him from a tree. As the news spread, 1,000 people gathered to view his body. I should stop here and just mention that there are some white Christian nationalist groups today that have been retelling the story of Leo Frank and arguing that, in fact, he was guilty. Frank's lynching stunned the nation, but anti-Semitism continued to spread. In the early 1920s, Henry Ford sponsored the writing of a series of anti-Semitic articles, later published in 4 volumes as The International Jew, which claimed that scheming Jews controlled the world's finances and bore ultimate responsibility for the economic ills of the United States. In 1938, the Nazi government of Germany awarded Ford the Grand Cross of the German Eagle. Many white Protestants speculated that an international cabal of Jews wanted to destroy what Ford described as the Anglo-Saxon culture of the United States. The assumption that true Americans were white Protestants, not Catholics or Jews, persisted into the mid-20th century, but it was gradually replaced by a more capacious understanding of a Judeo-Christian or tri-faith America. Neither anti-Semitism nor anti-Catholicism ever fully disappeared, as we can still see today, but white Protestants became increasingly worried about the rising tide of secularism, and they recognized that Catholics and Jews could be valuable allies in the fight to preserve the nation's religious identity. a crucial point of unity was that by the late 19th century, many Catholics and Jews shared the popular consensus that the United States stood as a beacon of political and religious freedom. This is one of the greatest ironies in American history. Despite their struggle for full acceptance in the United States, Catholics and Jews eventually embraced the belief in American chosenness as their own. On the Catholic side, Pope Leo XIII was so troubled by American Catholics' enthusiasm for their new country that he published an encyclical in 1899 rebuking the heresy of what he called Americanism, the belief that the church should become more American and modern in its teachings. On the Jewish side, Mary Anton, who had spent her childhood in Russia in terror of the pogrom, published a best-selling book in 1912, The Promised Land, which praised America as Zion. Both Catholics and Jews gained a modicum of political and religious acceptance in the United States by reaffirming its founding myth. This brings me to my fourth point. Throughout American history, many who have been deprived of equality, especially enslaved people and women of all races, have demanded greater rights by appealing to the nation's God-given destiny. Consider, for example, the remarkable story of Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved woman, a poet, and the first Black woman to be published in what would become the United States. In 1774, Wheatley condemned the avarice and hypocrisy of white patriots who ruthlessly practiced slavery while lamenting their own supposed enslavement by the British because of taxation. In a letter to Samson Occam, a Native American Christian, Wheatley reversed the meaning that white patriots ascribed to the book of Exodus by portraying enslaved and indigenous people as the biblical Israelites and Americans as their Egyptian oppressors. In every human breast, she testified, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance, and by the leave of our modern Egyptians, I will assert that the same principle lives in us. Her letter was widely reprinted in American periodicals, a rebuke to white slaveholders who dared to represent themselves as victims rather than as oppressors. Yet despite her anger at Americans' failure to live up to their own ideals, Wheatley also affirmed that ultimately God had destined the United States to be a beacon of freedom. In 1784, in a poem which personified the new nation as a woman, Columbia, Wheatley imagined Columbia spreading, quote, heavenly freedom around the globe. Like white patriots, Wheatley portrayed the nation as an agent of God, but she insisted that the United States could not fulfill its God-given destiny until it abolished slavery. Later in the 19th century, both white and African-American women would make a similar argument in reference to women's suffrage. Frances Willard, the founder of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, a mostly white organization, claimed that women needed the vote in order to protect the home and the republic. In her words, mother-hearted women are called to be the saviors of the race. Willard had begun her career as a temperance activist, convinced that alcohol was responsible for poverty and domestic violence, but she soon became convinced that Christian mothers could not cleanse the nation of its sins without the power of the vote. God's plan for the United States, she argued, could not be realized without women's political equality to men. Perhaps more than anyone else in American history, Martin Luther King Jr. revealed the revolutionary potential of the belief in American chosenness. In contrast to the Ku Klux Klan, who argued that God wanted America to be a white nation, King insisted that God had chosen America to be a model of racial reconciliation and equality. In his letter from Birmingham jail, he testified, I hope the church as a whole will meet the challenge of this decisive hour. But even if the church does not come to the aid of justice, I have no despair about the future. We will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation because the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with the destiny of America. We will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands. The motto of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was to redeem the soul of America. King's language reveals that historically the belief in American chosenness has been widely shared by Americans with competing visions of the nation. Imagining America as a city on a hill, a new Israel, or a Redeemer nation has been part of a tradition of consensus. On one hand, this consensus may have served to stifle dissent. There have been relatively few radicals in American history. I think of someone like Malcolm X or Native American activists who have fully rejected the idea that the United States has a special religious and political mission. On the other hand, the consensus about American chosenness also seems to have helped to mediate change, holding the nation together as Americans have embraced revolutionary movements like feminism and civil rights. The belief in American chosenness, as revealed by the examples of Francis Willard and Martin Luther King, has sometimes been used to bring about progressive goals. This brings me to my final point. Ever since the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan, who frequently borrowed John Winthrop's language in order to hail the United States as a city on a hill, the language of American chosenness has been more identified with political conservatives than with liberals. Many Democratic politicians have tried to reclaim this language as their own. Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton both described the United States as an exceptional nation, and Joe Biden has echoed Martin Luther King by promising to redeem the soul of America. But white Christian conservatives have been particularly successful in mobilizing around the idea that they and they alone are the righteous defenders of the nation's special covenant with God. Like John Winthrop, who warned the Puritans that God might withdraw his favor if they fell into sin, they have spent the past 40 years claiming that God is angry with the nation because of a multitude of sins: secularism, gay rights, feminism, and more recently, critical race theory and the catch-all category, wokeness. Some of you may remember that after 9/11, Jerry Falwell Sr. suggested that God had withdrawn his protection of the United States out of anger about the nation's political and religious direction. During an interview with Pat Robertson on the 700 Club, Falwell said, "I really believe that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians who are actively trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, People for the American Way, all of them who have tried to secularize America, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen." During the past decades, Christian conservatives have repeatedly echoed Falwell's warning that an angry God might break his covenant with the United States. This is one of the reasons that they have responded so fervently to the slogan, "Make America Great Again." Underlying the anger of white Christian conservatives is a deep sense of loss. There have been many reasons for the resurgence of a virulent form of white Christian nationalism in the United States, but a key issue is the decline of the white Christian population. In the early 1990s, roughly 90% of the population identified as Christian, but by 2022, that percentage had dropped to around 66%. Similarly, in 1980, 80% of the population identified as white, but by 2022, that percentage had dropped to 60%. many Christian conservatives faced with massive demographic change long for a world that they have lost. According to a recent survey from the Public Religion Research Institute, 27% of Americans agreed or mostly agreed with the statement, "The U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation." And 30% agreed or mostly agreed with the statement, "Being Christian is an important part of being truly American." We stand at a perilous moment in American history. As I've tried to show tonight, white Christian nationalism is not new, and the myth that the United States is a chosen nation has been part of our history since the founding. But there is a significant difference between the 18th century and the present. The white Christian nationalists who supported the American Revolution were tainted by their racism and their refusal to extend political rights to women, but they defended the principle of democracy, even if it was only partially fulfilled, as a positive good. This helps to explain why so many marginalized men and women throughout American history, people like Phyllis Wheatley and Martin Luther King Jr., were inspired by the claim that the United States is God's chosen nation. They wanted to believe that the nation has a transcendent purpose that bends toward equality and justice. Today, however, white Christian nationalists are so convinced that they have been called to uphold the nation's special covenant with God that they have been willing to dismantle the legacy of the American Revolution, including the separation of church and state. Determined to preserve their political dominance, many are no longer committed to the core principles of democracy. White Christian nationalists believe they must protect the nation, which they see as sacred, from the government, which they argue has become corrupt. Let me conclude by emphasizing that despite my admiration for activists like Martin Luther King Jr., I do not want to preserve the myth of American chosenness. Even in its most progressive forms, American Christian nationalism is built on ideas that too often have been used to justify imperialism and xenophobia. Those of us who identify as Christian have a particular responsibility to explain to the public why white Christian nationalists do not speak for us. I have sometimes feared, and I know I'm not alone in this, that the entire Christian tradition has been sullied by its association with the ugliness that we see on our landscape today. If we do not want John Winthrop's stern warning to come true, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God. We must continue to explain why white Christian nationalism is contrary to the message of freedom, human dignity, and the common good that represents the best of both the American and Christian traditions. Thank you.
Good evening again, everyone. Welcome again to this year's Shurden Lectures. I want to acknowledge and thank Amanda Tyler and the BJC for inviting me to moderate this evening's panel. I am Jaimie Crumley. I am the Research Fellow at Old North Illuminated, and I'm grateful that Old North Illuminated and the congregation for allowing me to contribute to their work this year. To our online and in-person audiences, thank you so much for spending your Wednesday evening with us. Thank you, Dr. Brekus, for your thought-provoking lecture. We look forward to hearing more from you in a few minutes for the panel discussion. And I think we can all take another moment to applaud her incredible and important work. So this evening, I'm going to moderate our panel discussion, which is on the theme of the myth of American chosenness. We have an incredible group of panelists. Please allow me to introduce them to you. First, I want you to meet the Right Reverend Carol Gallagher, PhD. Bishop Gallagher is the assistant bishop in the Episcopal Church's Diocese of Massachusetts. She is an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation. Before she began her current role as assistant bishop, Bishop Gallagher served the Diocese of Massachusetts as a regional canon. Before that, she was the assistant bishop in the Diocese of Montana. In Montana, she developed relationships with Native leaders and the congregations. She also educated and trained clergy and lay leaders about race, gender, and inclusion. We are grateful to have her as a panelist this evening. Next, I'll introduce you to Reverend Darrell Hamilton. Darrell, you're over there. Are you mic'd up? Okay, so we need to get Darrell a mic. Okay. So Reverend Hamilton is an ordained Baptist minister. He currently serves as the administrative pastor at the First Baptist Church in Jamaica Plain and the Protestant chaplain at Babson College. He is a member of the board of directors of the Alliance of Baptists and held leadership positions as the program director for the City Missions Urban Pastoral Ministry Program and the Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign. He is on the board of directors of the American Baptist Churches of Massachusetts, and we are grateful to have Reverend Hamilton as one of our panelists this evening. Finally, I want you to introduce you to Dr. Michael Hoberman. Dr. Hoberman is a professor of American literature at Fitchburg State University. At Fitchburg State, he teaches courses on Jewish literature, African-American literature, New England literature, and much more. He is the author of 2 books. In 2011, he published his book, New Israel, New England, which is a book that examines the history of colonial New England through the lens of the Judeo-centric worldview of its first settlers. In 2018, he published 100 Acres of America, which restores Jewish American writers to their roles as critical members of the American literary landscape from the 1850s to the present day. We are so pleased to have him as a panelist this evening. So panelists, I will invite you to come on up and take your seats. So our panel discussion for this evening is supposed to last for about 50 minutes. We're going to try to keep it to about 45 so that we can continue to run on time this evening. So I've prepared some questions for our panelists, and I'm also going to invite them to be in conversation with each other. As you can see, our panelists have places of convergence in their work that will yield compelling discussion. We will not have time for questions for the audience after the panel, but please be in touch with our panelists after this event if you have specific questions that you wish to ask them. Great. Is the mic on? Okay. Okay. So grateful that everyone is here. The traffic in Boston today was a little atrocious, from what I understand.
Yes.
So if you can't get here by walking, I guess it's a little bit difficult. So my first question is for the entire group. Catherine just used her speech to offer us her perspective on what the phrase American chosenness means. But I'm curious to hear from our other panelists this evening, how do you define the idea of American chosenness?
Want to start?
No, I'm going to follow you.
You sure?
Yes.
Okay. I think as an Indigenous person, it's very hard to hear that phrase without understanding the price it was paid. Not only in lives, but land, people taken by disease, assumed to be less than, and the reality of even until the 20th century, Native folks didn't get the right to vote until long after women got the right to vote. Mm-hmm. And so in the past 100 years, up until really the past 30 or 40 years, Indigenous tribes have not even had the ability, any autonomy to even control their own lives and their own destiny. Mm-hmm. So I think the chosenness is really hard to hear from a very historical perspective of what has happened. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, being a member of a tribe that was many generations Christianized. It's very hard to separate Christian identity for some tribal people, not all of us, but particularly on the East Coast, with their Christianity. So it's a very complicated understanding of that way.
Well, the research that I do is mostly on early Jewish American history. When I say early, I mean mostly the period before the large immigration comes here in the late 19th century. So we're talking what we call the colonial era. When the word chosenness comes to me, I think, well, okay, this is, of course, the burden of the Jews to either have that idea imposed upon them or to be broadcasting the idea. So to be chosen is not necessarily to be, in a good position in the world in the first place. And I think if I think about this concept of being, Jews as the chosen people, to me it's always felt like much more of a burden and a liability than anything else. That being said, of course, the history of Jews in America has been a mixed bag. And it has brought with it all kinds of, from a certain perspective, all kinds of blessings. I think some of those blessings are, the results of many of the things that Catherine was talking about, which is to say that the so-called founders, on a certain level, were not trying to found a Christian nation. And so for that reason, the doors were open to practitioners of any religious faith who wanted to show up. All that being said, as time has passed, chosenness for Jews in America has often correlated to the status that Jews have had in many instances as white people. And so it's as I say, it's a mixed blessing. It's something about which to feel quite ambivalent. It's no mystery, it's no secret that the earliest Jewish settlers in North America were participants in the same conquest and enslavement that white Protestants were participating in. They were not immune to any of those tendencies. And so some of those people read chosenness not very differently from how white Christian nationalists may be reading it today.
No, this is a great question. And for me, I would say the emphasis on the word chosen, and me as an African-American, a Black American minister, I feel like I sort of live in an interesting sort of middle space between my indigenous colleague and my Jewish colleague here, where to have an idea about chosenness, and because of the color of my skin, the mark on my skin means that I am therefore barred from any degree of chosenness, right? At the same time, the people in the text for which this myth is derived from, their skin is more likened to mine than it is to the people who derive the myth, right? And so my skin is used or rather is weaponized against me from being able to be included within the myth, within the story of America, when the reality is you can't even have America without my story, right? But yet erased from the myth, right? And at the same time, the way in which the very Hebrew scriptures play such a prominent role in the way in which we derive our humanity. Dr. King talks about, your somebodyness, right? But when you read the story of the Exodus, they are in Africa. They are not being exodused from Europe. So you are reading the story of African people. And our text is the story of African people. And so it's like I said, so it's an interesting interplay. And then the fact of being brought over to a place that was already inhabited without say. So in a sense, we have some, I don't want to say complicity, but yet we are still sort of used in a way that allows for the commodification and for the taking of indigenous land also, while at the same time being a people with no land, no culture, no identity, then having to derive new culture and new identity for ourselves here. So again, it's an interesting sort of place to be. But thinking about that idea of chosenness and what it means to be kept from or barred from being included within this understanding of the myth, and then also just the fallacy, I think, that chosenness even presents.
Yeah, I want to have like follow-up conversations with all of you about what you just said, because I think there's a lot of depth there. Thinking about, in this congregation and my research, I'm finding people who were Native people from Natick, right? And I got an email from a woman who's part of the Nipmuc tribe in response to one of my research videos, and she was talking about the challenge of wanting to be taken seriously in the Native community as a Native person, and yet the complications of being also strongly identified with Christianity, and that's been a large part of the story of Indigenous people in Natick and in other places throughout the United States. So there's really that complication and challenge there. While we're on the topic of marginalized people, I'm actually going to turn to you, Darrell, first to answer this question, but I'd love to hear from others also. In Catherine's speech tonight, and also in a lot of her previously published writings, she argues that marginalized people, especially religious minorities and people of color in the United States, have historically appealed to the notions of divine destiny when advocating for their rights. Right. And your response just had me thinking about this. So how do you think that's played out in the African-American theological tradition?
Yeah. And I want to say, I think that's just such a really powerful and profound point that you made. And to be really frank, like I haven't stopped chewing on it. That's a really good piece of meat, that you prepared. So trying to digest that. But the way in which I think that it plays out is, again, being how do I want to say this? Being part of a people and a legacy that has lost culture, that has had culture stripped, that has had language stolen, right? How do you sort of create a new sense of identity? What is it that you grasp hope onto, right? And I don't think that it's inherently part of the hope in the myth of American chosenness in the way in which the framers or the Puritans might have themselves tried to derive it. But African American people, we have a history of the way in which we re-signify on the theology, on the history, on the story of America, of Jesus, of the way in which we have to find a way in which this story can create life and be generative for our people, right? So when you think about the practices of enslaved Africans, where you spend all day hearing the narrative of slave obey your masters, you're legally barred from reading, let alone reading Bible, and yet at night you then make your way to the woods, to the hush harbors, and you are able to connect with a sense of the divine that is deep within you, that can't be stripped nonetheless, right? This sense of hope, knowing that there is indeed something that God is doing on behalf of you, on behalf of people. And I want to also say this too, because when you think about the myth of American chosenness, this idea that it's incumbent upon white settlers to bring Christianity to African people. Again, Christianity is an African religion. African people, we had Jesus before white settlers ever even thought the name Jesus. We had Jesus, right? And so this notion of connecting with that Jesus, somebody might call it the Black Christ, right? And then, okay, so we are here in this new place, having to find new identity, having to create new language, and yet we have hope in the sense of a God that is still with us, that loves us, that is still going to provide and call for something new. So we put our hope in that thing, and we pray that a process of democracy can be used as a tool of the divine to help get us to whatever telos, whatever end it is that God might be trying to create for us and then for the world. So I hope that's not too convoluted of a response, but the way in which I sort of see how we as a people in our, I don't want to just say that we are resilient, but in the way we've been forced to be resilient and to make meaning and to make new meanings, and to continue to find God and to draw deeper into faith. I see that as sort of how we sort of respond to that.
Yeah. Michael, did you want to tag in on
Well,
that?
I mean, I guess I'm thinking about some of these voices in let's say, the pre-Civil War Jewish American community, and some kind of two approaches that were taken on the part of Jewish leaders during these times to either sort of buy into this idea of, America being a redeeming country for Jews, or to sort of back off from it carefully and again, cautiously invoke principles of secularism, just because secularism is the safest bet if you're a member of a minority religion, which I think is quite well appreciated by this audience. But I did dig up a couple interesting, and to me anyway, disturbing, not surprising, but disturbing quotations. So in 1858, Isaac Mayer Wise, who was a very significant Jewish leader based in Cincinnati, he delivers a speech on July 4th. It kind of reminded me in a strange way. There's some echoes of the Frederick Douglass speech, but not enough echoes, as you'll hear. He says, next to the Passover feast, the 4th of July is the greatest Jewish holiday, implied, because it is the memorial of the triumph of liberty. It is the second redemption of mankind from the hands of oppressors, the second interposition of providence on behalf of liberty. So that's a pretty strident claim from the perspective of a Jewish rabbi to be invoking the Hebrew Scriptures as a ringing endorsement of American chosenness. And then another person, Isaac Harvey, who was a leader, sort of a lay leader in Charleston, South Carolina's Jewish community, 1820s, 1830s, is considered to be one of the founders of Reform Judaism. First of all, he refers to South Carolina itself as this happy land for Jews. South Carolina Charleston was a great haven for the Jews in the 1820s and 30s. It actually had a larger Jewish community during that time than New York did. And these Jews in Charleston were merchants of different sorts, participants, as most merchants in Charleston were, participants either directly or indirectly in the slave trade. In any case, Harvey says about America, it is the land of promise spoken of in our sacred scriptures, in our ancient scriptures. So sometimes you're going to hear those echoes from Jewish leaders, and sometimes you don't. Gershom Satius, the last person I'll mention, who led the Jewish community in New York and then Philadelphia during the Revolutionary War, he issues several prayers for peace during the Revolution. And his prayers for peace are very cautious in the sense that, kind of the way Lincoln did during the Civil War, he sort of suggests that, well, we hope that God is on our side. We're not sure if God has chosen us. We better try to live up to what we think God expects of us. So I think the responses run the gamut from those two extremes.
Darrell, when you were talking, it reminded me of David Walker, who I know some of you, are very familiar with David Walker's writings, and his real appeals to Christian scriptures and his really incendiary, for lack of a better term, critiques, right, of Southern Christians, of Southern white Christians, for failing to live up to the terms of their own faith tradition. I want to talk a little bit more about just the use of the Hebrew Bible, right? I know, Catherine, you talked about that some in your speech, and we heard you referencing, I guess it's from Deuteronomy, right? That comes up in the Winthrop lecture, where Moses is not able to go to the Promised Land, right? And so, Michael, I want to hear from you a little bit about that. Just about how the Hebrew Bible specifically was used to justify colonialism and what that has meant. For Jewish people, you talked about the Jewish people in the 19th century. What does that mean that that the Hebrew Bible had already been deployed so much and continued to be deployed so much through the 19th century?
Well, in the earlier phases of the colonial period, and in my book about Jews and Puritans that I think Jaimie mentioned in the bio, mostly what I write about is the way Jews were sort of inadvertent interlocutors with Christian theologians, Puritan theologians, who were, of course, as we're hearing, fascinated by the Hebrew Bible. And so every now and then they consult Jews or Jewish scholarship to, sort of shore up their arguments. And one of the most prominent instances of that is Ezra Stiles, who Catherine mentioned in her talk with the 1783 sermon. So Stiles was a minister in Newport, wanted to learn Hebrew, and thought that the most expedient way to do so was to consort with the Jews in Newport, the people who created what we call the Touro Synagogue now. And so he met several rabbis, visiting rabbis and Jewish scholars, and mostly it seems as though they would just sort of hear his theories about the Hebrew Bible and politely, offer more, sort of footnoted the things that Stiles wanted to be able to say about the Hebrew Bible. But as things progress and you get closer to sort of the crisis point that leads, we're skipping ahead to the period of the middle of the 19th century and pre-Civil War period. I wrote a piece a few years ago about how Exodus is used, particularly sort of a comparative reading so when Benjamin Franklin or other, let's say, Anglo-Protestant or even Anglo-secular Protestant people invoke the book of Exodus, they do it in the ways that Catherine mentioned. So America is the promised land, and the English people crossing the Atlantic or crossing the Red Sea. Well, for Jews during that time period, Exodus was not about America being the promised land. It was about the Jews being saved from Egypt, from Egyptian slavery. And as it applied to the Civil War, well, like everything else, it broke down according to which part of the country you were in. So Jews on the northern side of the Mason-Dixon line would have perhaps read Exodus in one way, and to be honest, there were Jews in the South who read Exodus as, it's certainly not about black people's liberation. It's about the liberation of the Jews, and maybe, there were a few instances where Exodus was the story of the Confederates being free to do what they wanted to do. What's interesting to me here is that when you look at again, the Anglo-Protestant tradition, it's taking the Hebrew text and universalizing it, and then sort of superimposing it over Anglo experience. For Jews, it's much more particularistic. This is our story of our liberation. And interestingly enough, of course, that's how African-American ministers would have read Exodus too. This is a story about us. As Darrell was saying, this is a story about our Exodus, or our hoped-for Exodus. We originate in Africa, and here we are in Egypt, in America. How did that happen? So, yeah.
I do want us to dig in a little bit more into the Bible, and especially how the Bible has been used in contemporary rhetoric, right, to justify contemporary Christian nationalism. But before that, Carol, I want to bring you back into the discussion because your ministry reflects the ways that Native people have maintained their sovereignty despite the encroachments of the American settler state. So how do you think it is that Indigenous leaders have been so successful about not allowing their voices to be co-opted by these narratives of divine destiny that we've been talking about? How do you think that's been happening?
Well, I think one of the realities is America as a whole has paid little or no attention to Indigenous people up until very recent history, except for what you all watched in cowboys and Indian movies. And most people believed we were all gone. And until, there's lots of things that Richard Nixon did really poorly, as we well know, but during the Nixon administration was where we first began to have tribal sovereignty. And we've had to learn as Native people how to govern ourselves and to claim those voices. Many of our people, many of my mother's generation, were not allowed to speak their language. They were not allowed to do their traditions. The laws didn't come off the books in the state of Oklahoma and other places and well into the late 70s. So you could be arrested and go to prison for practicing your traditional ways. And most of these people were also Christian, but, various different seasons, the green corn and other seasons that we celebrate as Cherokees, that was all done under the cover of darkness. What happens when people are sorely oppressed for generation after generation is, and there's a resilience in this, is you go underground. You go underground, and so our community celebrations often happened under cover of darkness after midnight. People, this is a very Oklahoma thing, but pulling up their pickups with the lights off so that they wouldn't get caught. But still, so I think there's that need to continue their identity, but many people, particularly my mother's generation, the generation before, so my mother was born in 1923, were told that their way of life was bad. My grandfather grew up hearing, kill the Indian, save the man. That was our national policy. And there was a lot of killing, just death. If any of you go to Carlisle, you'll see the hundreds and hundreds of little crosses of children that just died, some of illness and many for just desperate loneliness and not being able to thrive. So, I think the gift of both being out of anybody's view is that the ability to go underground and retain. The Cherokees had something they called the Pin Society at the early 20th century where all their traditions were outlawed, so the traditional men would wear just not even a safety pin, but just a straight pin in their lapel so they can identify one another to each other. But that was the only way to be who they were. So.
Yeah, it's interesting because it keeps coming up, I think, during this discussion and during your speech, the importance of language, right? And the harm that language can do, the harm of all these reinterpretations even of the Christian scriptures, but also the loss of language, right? In the case of African peoples who came from all sorts of different countries and regions and were stripped of their indigenous languages and cultures, and in the case of indigenous peoples who similarly, even the phrase African peoples, indigenous peoples, right? Even that is violent language, right? Because it's overlooking the particularities of the places and the particular groups that people belong to.
For most part, when asked, how do you want to be referred to as Native American, indigenous, and when I write, I use a multiplicity of titles just to help people understand that they're all, our spiritualities are not the same by tribe, so we want to be called by our tribal name.
Right.
I had a dear friend passed away a long time ago, but she was very powerful, very in the 1970s, and really sort of on the forefront of really moving both the church and Native people forward. Used to say, Columbus was looking for a trade route to India, so that's why we got called Indians. Thank God he wasn't looking for a trade route to Turkey. But, there's also the ability to have a sense of humor even in the midst of oppression, and that's one of the things that's fairly common among the groups represented here, I would think.
Definitely. Catherine, I want to bring you into the conversation. You have this piece called Examining the Roots of American Chosenness, which was first published on July 2nd, 2015. If you just go on the internet and type in the phrase American Chosenness, this little piece will pop up by Catherine Brekus. You should go and read it after this. It is quite good and also short if you don't have a bunch of time to read today. Catherine, in that piece, you talk about, and I was very fascinated by this, I was doing a deep dive on this today, the American Patriot Bible. And we need to talk about this. And then I also want to bring Darrell and Carol. I want to bring the two of you in because I know you all are doing, ministry on the ground with the Christian people today. But this American Patriot Bible, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about this, and also, what do you make of it? What do you make of this Bible literally being turned into a primer for American nationalism?
So actually, I have written a much longer piece just on the American Patriots Bible, and if anybody's interested, I'd be happy to send you a copy. The American Patriots Bible is really a fascinating and, to me, very disturbing document. It is the King James Version of the Bible, and within the pages, as you turn pages, there are pieces of American history woven into the text. So it's not as if there's just some material at the beginning of the Bible and then you read the Bible. You literally turn the pages of Genesis and there's Dick Cheney. Yes, this is always, my students are getting a little bit past this. They don't know who Dick Cheney is, but every time I see Dick Cheney, I'm sort of startled. And he's giving us a quotation about freedom. And so what you're supposed to think as you're reading this Bible is that the biblical story and the American story are echoing each other, that they're parallels, that actually the Bible is, in fact, in many ways, a story about the United States. So there are pictures of presidents, there are half-page articles about notable American figures. There is a piece, it's so interesting, at the beginning of the book of Exodus. Every chapter in the Bible has a little introduction, and there actually is a mention of the Pilgrims and the Puritans and how they recapitulated the story of Exodus. So these ideas are really still present. So this is a Bible that really sacralizes the nation and suggests that the United States itself is redemptive. There was a fair amount of controversy when the book was published. Even Christianity Today, which is the evangelical magazine founded by Billy Graham, there was an article in Christianity Today that said that this book is an example of idolatry, that it's treating the nation or putting the nation on the same level as Jesus. But despite that, the book seems to have been really quite popular, and there have been other books that have followed. There's one by David Barton called The Founder's Bible, which is really just sort of a ripoff, except if anything, it's even more conservative. There are hints in the American Patriots Bible that when you're reading the story of Ishmael, that you're supposed to be thinking about Muslim terrorists. But in the Founder's Bible, it's made explicit. So you could see the kinds of parallels that are being drawn. One of the fun things to do is to go on the Amazon website and just read the reviews of the American Patriots Bible. People love this book. The review that has always stuck with me is somebody wrote, "I'm giving this book 1 star." I was looking for all the bad reviews. There were very few. "I've given this book 1 star because the person depicted on page so-and-so is neither an American nor a patriot." So I had to go look and see what...
It's Obama.
It was Barack Obama.
Oh, no. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, you knew. You knew.
Right away.
I should have known immediately that it was going to be Barack Obama. So.
I'm surprised he was it.
So I think this shows you just the depth of white Christian nationalism in our own time, that a book like this could be published, that it could be popular, and that despite some outcries, it's in circulation.
Oh, I looked it up on Amazon. I don't want to support it, but I'm also like, I need a copy of this.
So somebody bought me a copy secondhand, which made me happy. A student bought this for me because I did not want to give the
buy it off the
author
person that
royalties.
gave it 1 star.
Yes, really. He returned it. Yes, he was so angry.
So that makes me turn to you, Carol, and also to you, Darrell, because both of you, of course, are in church context. So what does this real resurgence that we've seen in Christian nationalism, these biblical defenses of Christian nationalism, how is it impacting the church, or how do you imagine that it might impact the contemporary church?
You know, one of the challenges for us, and I, as an Episcopalian, the Episcopal Church grew out of the Church of England, the Anglican Church. So, you know, we're both a mixture of those folks who adore everything English and, you know, very rooted Americans who are very much working, I mean, across the board, a variety of folks. And one of the things that we've been doing in this diocese is working, we have a racial justice commission, and working very just across the board, all of our commissions, anybody who's doing anything, just really educating folks about what it means to really be a Christian and what we both carry and our responsibility, but also, forwarding the conversation about liberation for all. And that includes the LGBTQ folks who we are, often as an Episcopal church in trouble with the rest of the Anglican Communion for that advocacy. But the reality is unless we're, I am totally convinced and, will preach it, rising tides lifts all boats, and those who have to be, to shove others down, to be in control or power, ends up, it's just not the way we're going to be. And so that's really the dialogue that I keep, and, Alan and all of us who work in this diocese and here at Old North, we're really trying to encourage people to see that diversity is in its fullest. And people being able to be themselves in their fullest is really God's best gift. If you want to talk about chosenness, it's in diversity, not in shoving other people away.
That's right. Yeah, and so I feel like I'm noticing two trends. So the church that I serve, we are a part of the Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists. It's Pride Month tomorrow, so we pride ourselves, on being very progressive in our theology and our approach, and being intentional, particularly about how we challenge and confront, whiteness, white supremacy, and the vestiges of that, whether that's Christian nationalism, whether that's capitalism, whether that's just other international issues. And so the challenge that I feel that's had in our church, particularly being a predominantly white church, is for white Christians, white progressive Christians, the question of why should I still be Christian? And how it is that Christianity and white supremacy, white nationalism have gotten so interwoven, many of them raised up in churches where these things have been so interwoven, either in our congregation and really doing the work of trying to, I don't want to use the word deconstruct, it's the only one coming to mind. I know people, run with that. But when it comes to their theology and really sort of assess that and how they want to build it up again, but at the same time with that wrestling, knowing the legacy of Christianity, the legacy of their own churches. So why should I still be Christian? What is it about this message of Jesus that I latch on to that's important to me? There is some secularization that happens at times, but I also think people who come to church are doing so because they're being very, very intentional, because this is the place they want to be. They want to engage this in a spiritual and a Christian way. And then I'm also serving a college environment where a lot of the generation of students in college, the prevailing and pervasive theology, unbeknownst to majority of them, is a white Christian nationalist theology, where they are getting inundated with on the regular. Why? Because it's popular. Why? Because it's loud. You go to TikTok, and that's where they're getting so much of their faith formations on TikTok. But boy, if TikTok ain't got some toxic theology, right? And these young folks who don't really understand how to parse the nuances of their faith, they trying to tell me what it means to be Christian. And I'm like, boo, you just decided to follow Jesus 2 days ago. You know what I mean? I've been doing this for 30-some years. You know what I mean? Like, and so it's an interesting bag, right? And so you see how pervasive, how powerful the movement has been, because honestly, and it's mind-boggling me, I feel like, and I'm not talking about my particular students, but just the generation of those students and younger, I'm like, they seem like they are going to be more racist than their grandparents. And I think a lot of that is intentional, because whiteness knew it was going to lose its majority power by 2040 something. And so the only way that they can, maintain power is to dismantle democracy. It's the only way you can do it. And then you preach these things and talk about these things so regularly. And to give these students credit again, I'll end here, there is an inward wrestling, because they got friends who are queer. They see George Floyd being murdered on television. So that's a challenge. But at the same time, they go to churches that are telling them that a theology around justice, let's not talk about liberty, but let's talk about justice, that is somehow woke, and that being woke is somehow antithetical to being Christian. So it's an interesting bag.
So we are about at the end of our time. So I just want to acknowledge and maybe give people like a quick moment to respond if we have time. In the contemporary United States, we know that many people do not identify as belonging to any particular religious sect. Yet, I think, Darrell, your comments just kind of leaned in that direction. We do see an uptick in Christian nationalist rhetoric. And as you said, a lot of it is online discourse. So we know that it's not just common among older generations, as we might assume, is also commonly heard among younger generations. So in the brief time that we have remaining, I'm wondering, how do you all think that we can help people who do not identify as being Christian or as being religious at all to understand the impact of Christian nationalist discourse?
Well, I'm just going to jump in here because I think for Indigenous people, there's a level of sacredness of the land, people, the earth, that Christianity came to this continent and many embraced it. And when we move away from understanding sacredness and using the gifts we've been given, whoever we are, and it just becomes a commodity, a commercial, when it's bought and sold, that's when, in my mind, that's when, we're not doing any sort of religious life. We're just on Amazon. We're just purchasing to comfort some inward or external need. And so helping people have that dialogue about the difference between really living into the sacred versus, just getting a better complexion or whatever the commodity is, how important that is in helping people, no matter where they're coming from, to understand that.
I did a little homework before I came tonight, and so I was reading up on Catherine's many wonderful publications, and you had an anthology, American Christianities, and the free version on Amazon that I got I read the intro, and one of the most powerful observations I found in there that you made was that non-Christians in America, one thing they have in common is awareness that Christianity in America is power. And that's, so I really took that to heart as I was trying to apply it to, how I understand the place of Jews in America, but more broadly, if we can disentangle Christianity from power, right? If Christianity or whatever religion we're practicing, if it's disentangled from power, if it's disentangled from tribalism, then it can begin to mean something in people's lives along the lines of what Carol was saying. Easier said than done, but I think at least first we have to recognize that that Christianity is perceived by your students as power. It's a source of power, and if people learn to question that, that would be the first step.
Can you just repeat the question one last time?
Yeah, so with this current trend toward people not necessarily belonging to any particular religious group, how do we help people to understand the problem of Christian nationalism when they might not identify with Christianity?
Yeah, I think I've been sort of touching on it. It really just comes down to whiteness and white supremacy. And we have to get to a place where we are willing to, we encourage people to be willing to do the self-examination of their own complicity in whiteness and white supremacy. And don't get it wrong, just because, I know plenty of black people that are white supremacists, so it's not about phenotype of skin. But I think if we can help people to understand the insidiousness that is whiteness and white supremacy, then what we can actually come to terms with is the divinity, the sacredness, the holiness maybe even some power that is in the collective strength that is blackness, black power, black liberation. For all of us to see ourselves as connected to each other in a interconnected web of mutuality and shared humanity, right? Where we spend so much of our time trying to unrace ourselves. Maybe if we re-race ourselves and then see ourselves as human and then also kin and a part of the same human story, you know, we no longer need to wield power over anybody. You know, I was listening to somebody who said, you know, when you talk about, you know, someone being your brother, the other part of brother is other. So you see that person as the other version of yourself. You know, so if I can call you brother, then you're the other me, right? And so I can love you as the other me. We don't have to be the same, but we share the same blood, right? And we share some similar stories, right? And we call this same place home. We got the same mother. I'm gonna get real Baptist and say we got the same Father. Hallelujah. You know what I mean? But the point is that if we could get to a place of emphasizing and coming together under our shared humanity, I think that's the key. Yeah.
Great. Catherine, I'll give you the last word.
Well, as I'm sitting here listening to all of you, thank you so much for all these comments. I'm thinking back to this John Winthrop speech, which you might have gathered has just haunted me for years. And part of the reason for that is that so much of it is beautiful. And yet what Puritanism became is so horrifying. And I've always thought, what if that vision that he had of a group of people who were bearing one another's burdens as their own, who were laboring together and sorrowing together. He said that in regular times, people had to give out of their abundance, but in these extraordinary times, people were going to have to give out of their necessities in order to support others. And so what if that had been the vision, and that vision had not excluded others? That is a kind of chosenness that I think all of us would admire. So, and it's the kind of chosenness, I think, that is in the Hebrew Bible, where there is suffering and sacrifice that's involved.
Thank you so much to our panelists. I want to invite Amanda Tyler to come on up and wrap up our evening's lectures.
Thank you again to Dr. Brekus for your profound lecture, and join me also in thanking the Reverend Darrell Hamilton, Dr. Michael Hoberman, Bishop Carol Gallagher for your thoughtful and nuanced engagement with that lecture, which I think really enriched the conversation tonight. And last but not least, a very special thank you to Dr. Jaimie Crumley, not only for your skillful and brilliant moderation of this panel, but also for the person that I credit more than anyone else for being the reason that we are here tonight for this lectureship. Jaimie is really the bridge, being a BJC board member as well as a BJC fellow, whose vision for this event brought us here tonight and whose scholarship helped pull this panel together. So thank you, Jaimie. Well, I hope that you were challenged tonight. I hope that you learned something new, or a lot of things new. I certainly did. And I want to remind you of the many resources on the topic, not just the writings of our panelists and lecturer, but also resources available at bjconline.org and christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. Hosting conversations like tonight's is core to our work at BJC as an education and advocacy organization. I want to thank once again Buddy and Kay Shurden for their endowed gift that makes this series of lectures possible, whether in person or with our hybrid audience here tonight. We are able to bring you great programming like this thanks to generous donors who give gifts of all sizes. And so if you are inspired and dedicated to this work, I hope that you too will consider going online to bjconline.org/donate to help us continue providing engaging content like this to more audiences across the country and across the world. We are so grateful to your dedication to faith freedom for all and for your willingness to engage these hard questions and truths as we advocate for everyone's faith freedom. An invitation to our in-person audience here tonight to join us immediately after the program for a reception with our lecturer and panelists and our teams here. It will be here in the garden, so just exit out the church, go around, and the reception is waiting right out here. Thank you again to our speakers, to Buddy and Kay Shurden, to the combined Old North Church, Old North Illuminated, and BJC teams, and to all of you for joining us here tonight and for supporting this work. Good night.